Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar on en route to COP26. This whole event, the 3-day event, has been organized by a group of partners led by TDA, SLOCAT. You can see all in the bottom of that slide. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I lead the Ross Center at WRI. We are one of the partners. The session today is focused on green recovery and transport. How can we recover from the economic downturn right now, but also build a greener future? How can we do both things together? This is a topic that's been discussed. This series of events has been organized to coincide exactly a year before the next COP26 in UK, to actually drive ambition, drive agenda actors towards zero carbon, zero emission transport. Today we have a fantastic panel of speakers, mayors, leaders, climate leaders, academics from all over. The agenda is very straightforward. We're going to start with a keynote remark by Andrew Steer from WRI. I'll introduce Andrew in 1 minute, and then with a high-level panel discussion for about 60 minutes. The event will be about an hour and a half long. In some places it's been listed for 2.5 hours. That's not right. This event will be an hour and a half long. That's how we will be planning. So, Travis, can I go to the next slide, please? I just want to take a minute to introduce Andrew. Andrew is the CEO and the president of World Resource Institute. But more than that, he's been driving the thinking about how economic shift needs to take place while protecting climate. He was a leader who brought many organizations together to put together the new climate economy, actually presented to Paris COP, and recently has been leading the work at WRI on how can we build back better in this middle of this pandemic. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Annie. Welcome, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be here. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to the Dutch government in particular, Minister Stinger van Veldhoven, thanks to Herman Sips, and thank you, Annie, for your team putting this together. So my job is just to provide, if you like, a framing for the discussion that we're then going to have with the distinguished panelists. So I'm going to just share my screen, if I'm able to move it here. Just a second. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's not in presentation yet, Andrew. Just press that. We can see your screen.
Ah, yeah, there we go.
Perfect.
Good. Okay, so so look, there are two types of decision maker in the world today as they look at the current crisis. The first group basically says, look, this is the worst health crisis, the worst economic crisis in 100 years. We've got to focus on that. So don't talk to us about sustainability or climate change. We'll do that next year when we've recovered. There's another group that says, for heaven's sake, over the last 10 years, we've learned an enormous amount about how investing in more sustainability, investing to address climate change actually leads to a healthier economy, a quicker recovery. And so this is precisely the time when we should be looking at issues of sustainability and climate change. And so I'm going to talk about this today. Everybody knows the crisis we have right now. I don't need to share these numbers with you because they are tragically well known. The situation is absolutely and utterly dreadful. We pray for the quick arrival of a vaccine, but nobody expects next year, 2021, to be a rapid recovery from anything. The most recent IMF assessment of the economy, maybe by the end of next year, we will have almost recovered to where we were 2.5 years earlier. And of course, that has a devastating effect on the poor. If you look at the middle line, the brown line, that basically is if we do find a vaccine quickly. And even then, you'll see this is the declining path of the number of poor in the world. And so at least 100 million will be added to that. And you notice they don't immediately fall out of poverty. Once you've fallen into poverty, it takes a long time to get out of it. So this is a truly tragic situation. I'd like to remind everybody of sort of where we are on climate change. This is the emissions the world would need to have by 2030 if we are to have a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is where we're heading for today in 2030 if every country honors its current NDCs. So you can see we are not heading yet in the right direction. And just to sharpen our minds even more, this is where we need to be by 2050 if we are to go towards net zero. And of course, many countries now have committed to go towards net zero. They haven't committed yet, most of them, to the 2030 target. That's what we need to talk about. I think all of you know that the transport sector is a very important sector in terms of emissions, 14% of total emissions. If you look at the purple, that's light vehicles. Look at the bottom, the sort of dark, whatever color that is, that's trucks. Together, those two account for about 2/3 of transport-related emissions. But it's some of the ones in between that are going to be some of the most difficult. And of course, for some countries, like the United States, transport is already the biggest cause of climate change. So this sort of, if you like, frames the issue. And let's remind ourselves, this is not a static picture. This is where we were in 2000 in terms of vehicle use, and that's where we will be in 2050. So absent really dramatic change, the situation from transport is going to get worse. So first, maybe just a few words on the impact of the virus and the economic crisis on transport, the good, the bad, the ugly. The good, you can now see Mount Everest from Kathmandu. I'll bet you nobody until this year who's been to Kathmandu has had a view like this. So air is cleaner. In Wuhan alone, they think 12,000 deaths, mainly from premature deaths from air pollution, some from traffic as well, have been saved. And around the world, bike share has been increasing, Beijing 150%. And around the world, some very, very exciting innovations in terms of open spaces, pedestrians, cyclists. And of course, the trick is to make sure that these wonderful innovations are sustained. And we'll discuss that at the panel. So on to the bad. The very bad is the situation in public transportation. I suspect most of you know this, but municipal bus fleets and federally owned bus fleets and privately owned bus fleets and community owned bus fleets are in dreadful situation. Even before the pandemic, many of them were barely keeping their heads above water, and now they are well below water. And you see, even although things have come back, they're still 20% below where they were. And of course, it's not only that fare revenues have been lost, but actually the costs of running public transport have risen quite a bit due to requirements on physical distancing, sanitation. So these companies are now in very, very deep trouble all around the world, we should say. It is perhaps the most urgent thing that we need to address. And it has income distributional issues as well. In Santiago, for example, high-income users were able to just drop out, whilst low-income users had to continue to use the services, even although they were less frequent, less reliable, and originally more dangerous as well. Relatedly, unfortunately, there seems to have been, after a decade of incredibly hard work to gradually get people out of their cars and into public transport, now, if the surveys are right, they suggest that there may be a sort of re-ratchet effect where people get back in their cars and out of public transport. And it may well be several years before people trust public transport again. This is setting us back a long, long way, and we need to think very hard what to do about it. So look, coming on to what do we need to do, the hypothesis here, the proposition, which is a correct one, by the way, is that green transport is essential for a robust recovery. A green economy overall, there's a huge industry out there of really wonderful analysis. The World Resources Institute does a lot of it, but many others do it too. A green recovery could create 52 million new jobs, and 20% of that could come from the transport sector. Unfortunately, today, the evidence is of the money that has already been allocated, it doesn't look that great. Remember that in the next couple of years, between 10 and 20 trillion dollars worldwide will be spent by public entities to, if you like, grow the world economy out of its current crisis. There's never in the history of the world been a sum of money anywhere close to that. So it's incredibly important that we don't blow this opportunity, because 2 years from now, there won't be much money left. So it's really important that we spend it well. This chart, and I hope you can see it, it's not so clear. Well done, the Europeans. You'll see that the green above the line is sort of what share of the total spending that so far has been identified. And congratulations to Vivid Economics and others that did these calculations. You'll see Germany, UK, France, especially the European Commission, well done. Now, if you look at the very right-hand side, you might think, my goodness me, the United States is leading the way. Well, unfortunately not. This is Mr. Biden's statement of intent, but remember, he would have to get this through a Congress that he may not own in terms of his own party. If you want to know what the US has done so far, look at the left-hand side and look at the third from the left. You'll see US so far, $2 trillion allocated. Really none of it has been for a green recovery. So we're not in a good position. If you look overall at the spending in transport, and so far we've only been able to really identify about $260 billion of the reflationary money that's gone into transport. But you see, unfortunately, more than 2/3 of that has gone, if you like, to gray transport, old-fashioned fossil fuel, concrete intensive transport. So there's a lot to do. So the way to think about the recovery is top left-hand corner. The economic recovery is incredibly important. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Top right-hand corner, health and safety must have a priority. Bottom left-hand corner, we all know that this crisis has reminded us how unbelievably unfair the world is, how incredibly unincluded people are. So it has to be inclusive. Bottom right-hand corner, we have to address the issue of climate change during this rebound, because if we don't, we've lost the coming decade. So looking at sort of a three-pronged approach that actually hits all of these four at the same time, that is, if you like, the great sort of pearl of great price that we're looking for. The intersection of a program that can deliver all four. Invest in quality mass transit, shift travel to energy efficient modes, and electrify what is left. And it's important to remember that, you know, just as there's no one silver bullet, we need all players. There's no one actor either. So on the left-hand side, those same three things, invest in quality mass transit, etc. Cities have a role, country governments have a role, companies have a role, and their role will be differentiated. And one of the great tragedies of urban management around the world has been how little coordination there's been between central governments and city governments. Turns out that only about 1/3 of all the countries in the world even have a national urbanization strategy, let alone have full alignment and line of sight, if you like, throughout all the decision-making processes. So too with companies. And let's just remind ourselves of the incredible sort of analytical insights that are now almost universal truths. If you want to reflate your economy, you want the money to disperse quickly, you want it to generate jobs quickly, and you want it to be inclusive of people. Well, this will just look at one of those. $1 million invested in building roads will generate 8 jobs. $1 million invested in installing charging stations, 15 to 21 jobs. $1 million in EV manufacturing, 16 to 22 jobs. $1 million in expanding public transport, 23 to 29 jobs. The jury is no longer out on this. It is overwhelming, and yet so far we have failed to communicate this to members of parliament, governments that have to make decisions. They still are not getting this, and one of the great challenges for us is how do we communicate this? And let's remind ourselves, it's not just about which transport modes. It's how do you shape your city? It's not just about electrifying transport. Urban sprawl, as you may know, in the United States drags down the US economy by $1 trillion every year. And that's because several billion hours of valuable time stolen from companies and from families are wasted sitting in traffic or crawling along. And so as we think about reshaping cities, reshaping transportation, it has many, many benefits that all of you on the line are very familiar with, and our panel will probably discuss. 3.4 million people dying every year. $1.7 trillion is the cost that OECD countries pay because of pollutant-related illnesses and death. So in conclusion, just to sort of summarize, to frame the issue, if you like, 5 very simple strategies that governments need to take today. The first is strengthen public transport. For heaven's sake, start by stabilizing it. So social distance, make sure it's well ventilated, insist on masks, subsidize all of this. Strengthen public transport by being imaginative on how you finance it. Money is going to have to be plowed into public transport. It is a very high rate of return. London uses a congestion charge. What a brilliant idea. So $303 million goes straight back into public transport. We need to be very innovative in that. Countries like Nigeria, you know, have basically said, look, this is a crisis. Most of our informal bus services are privately run. We are going to help them during this crisis. This is about the highest possible use of funds that you could imagine, because if you don't do this, these companies are going to disappear forever. And by the way, be even braver. At times like this, we have to break the China. We have to go outside of our comfort zone. Do what Kansas City's just done, where several cities in France have done. Make it entirely free. There's now 100 mid-sized cities. Today, Annie organized a meeting of the Ross Center Advisory Group, and we had the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who's also the Minister of Defense, but he's also the Minister in charge of cities, and he absolutely insisted that from now on, all public transport in Luxembourg should be free. Yes, it costs a lot of money, but my goodness me, it has a fantastic rate of return. And let's use this crisis to harness data. I wish I could explain this to you. It's work that we've done in Addis Ababa, the WRI Ross Center has done, showing that actually even a poor city can use very sophisticated data now. Actually, it's not difficult to do. It can transform the way your city operates, and it can help bring services to the poor. Let's use this dreadful crisis to innovate, to leapfrog in a way that we've not managed to do before. So that's number one. Number two, double down on active transport. What is that? That's any transport that uses human energy. So walking, bicycling, and various sort of models of micro mobility that use both human power and other forms of power. Do not let us slip back to the old way of doing business. Citizens like an approach where they have more space to walk, to cycle, and so on. And setting ambitious targets. The mayor of Bogota just said, look, half of all trips are going to be made by walking and bicycling, and then he has to come up with a plan of how to deliver, and then he can monitor it. This is the kind of brave decision that can be made at a time like this. Why? Because citizens are willing to make big changes now, which they normally would not. Number three, the most obvious one, electrify transport. The UK, as you know, this last week committed to phase out totally internal combustion engines for small vehicles by 2030, brought it forward from 2035. That's a brilliant example, and now obviously many countries have committed to 2035. It's a brilliant example as that what they're going to do is focus as we head up to COP26. Let's see if we can get the world to phase out in 10 years. That is the kind of system-wide brave change that is required. Public charging stations have huge jobs and great payoff. And by the way, you have to obviously green your grid as well. I don't mean to imply, by the way, by what I'm saying that this is easy. It is not. This requires a degree of bravery of decision makers that we don't see in most places in the world. So don't misread me. I'm not saying this is a walk in the woods. This is difficult stuff. And don't just limit to small vehicles. Do what Santiago's done. Santiago says, why should China have 99% of all the electric buses in the world? We want a part of it. And German government, together with WRI and many others, are working on this. And the economics is now looking pretty good, actually. It turns out that long-term costs, including maintenance, actually, in many instances, are lower than more conventional vehicles. I should say that just last week, we were privileged to receive a large grant from the Bezos Earth Fund for $30 to $40 million to catalyze the electrification of 500,000 school buses in the United States. That's 80% of all of the buses in the United States. Why would we do it? Well, lots of reasons. Not only does it lower carbon directly, it also creates a generation of children who are used to now going to school in a clean bus, and we link it to curriculum development. They become champions for change. And by the way, every single bus is worth every year between $10,000 and $20,000 to a utility because they use the battery storage during the day to have electricity go backwards and forwards, especially during the hot summer months when the school buses don't run. It then becomes a storage facility for the entire grid. It's an amazing sort of era that we are entering upon. So electrify transport, do not forget freight. It's incredibly important. Freight at the moment is obviously, you also get your goods through the mail, through Amazon and Walmart and whatever works for you, wherever you are. The demand for goods is going to grow by 300%. So this must be electrified too. And it turns out that investing 0.6 trillion in efficient and electric urban freight has returns of $2.3 trillion. This is what Annie was getting at when he talked about what we call the new climate economy. There's been an intellectual revolution really over the last 5 to 8 years. We used to think addressing climate change would be nice to do, but it's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to cost jobs and a competitiveness in the short term. we now know that actually smart policies such as this, smart climate policies, they generate more economic efficiency, they drive new technologies, and they lower long-term risk for investors. These combined lead to more investment, lead to greater competitiveness, and lead to more jobs. And so this intellectual revolution is a terribly important development. Fourth, shift people and goods to rail. You know all about this, but again, the economics is shifting on this too. Turns out that for short haul air travel, high-speed rail is a very, very good investment. China has been using this time to actively shift goods to rail. Every country should do the same. Has a high upfront investment cost, but it is a much better investment cost than the tarmac and concrete for more roads, especially in cities. 5, clean R&D and innovation. It's sadly the current reflation, the bailing out. Most countries have not used the bailout to put conditions, for example, on airlines. Some have, like France. But without intervention, aviation will just grow and grow as a share. It could be over 1/4 of all emissions by 2050. And of course, until just a few years ago, we always used to say, oh, but you can't decarbonize air travel. That's one of the so-called hard to abate sectors, like steel and cement and ocean shipping. Well, it turns out that the so-called hard to abate sectors are not quite as hard as we had anticipated. And even in airlines now, there is going to be a way forward. But we do need to invest in it, in a hydrogen economy and in other techniques that are being explored. And so public money to support private research is a very good rate of return. So those were the 5 very sort of simple, broad ideas. Just in terms of COP26, which is what this event today is sort of heralding, if you like. As Annie said, it's 1 year exactly to when we will be in Glasgow. The key question is, will countries make ambitious commitments? Now, they are already making ambitious commitments for the long term. It is remarkable that as of today, 73 countries have said we are committed to net zero by 2050 and China by 2060. So too cities and businesses. In fact, now over 1,000 corporations have committed to so-called science-based targets to totally decarbonize. But that's the short term. That's the long term. The long term is easier to make a commitment than the short term. And the real question is, will these long-term commitments be given credibility by short-term national commitments for the decade of the 2020s, which is what the so-called NDCs are all about. And not many countries yet have put in their NDCs. And not many have yet really put transport into them. This is a map of the existing NDCs with regard to transport. Almost every country mentions transport. They mention it as a problem. They even sometimes say it needs to be part of the solution, but only a very few, those are the blue ones, actually have targets for the transport sector. This needs to change in the coming months because, as you know, 5 years after the Paris deal, countries need to come back with new and revised and more ambitious NDCs. That's the story of the coming few months. And so all of us that work with so many countries really need to do our best to put transport right in the heart of it. So just to sort of summarize, if you think about the immediate stimulus, let's think of these 4 here. Very simple ideas: bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, spend money on it. Public transport, liquidity, infrastructure, and integration, spend money on that and put policies in place. Avoid vehicle travel through limited highway spending. Resist by building another flyover or expanding another urban highway, and invest money in EV fleets and charging stations. If you like, that's the 2021 challenge. Medium-term measures that we need to be thinking about now as well. So a green investment plan for the avoid, shift, improve. Get that notion, that narrative in decision makers' heads. Carbon pricing for sustainable mobility, grid modernization, and investment in R&D carefully targeted. Then these things need to be factored in to the NDCs, which need to be submitted supposedly this month, but because the COP26 has been delayed a year, a lot of countries are actually going to submit their NDCs over the next 12 months, and then sort of heading towards the longer term goals. So that's sort of the way that we at the World Resources Institute and the WRI Ross Center, which Annie Dasgupta leads so well, that's how we think about things. So thank you very much indeed. Back to you, Annie.
Sao Paulo.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. You've given us concrete things to think about, 5 ideas. If I can get the panelists back up, thank you very much. Andrew, I hope you stick around for questions, but I'm going to focus on the discussion now. I'm going to introduce the panelist minute. I hope all of you remember Andrew's 5-point things we should think about as we think about recovery and decarbonization of transport. Can I have the slide up, or is it? I would like to introduce our fantastic panelists. I just want to remind everyone who's listening in what Andrew said at the beginning. What Andrew presented just now, the research behind it, the narrative behind it, is going to be part of a published paper that WRI is working on. It was commissioned by the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, very much driven by Minister Van der Hoeven. So we are very grateful for this partnership with the Dutch government. This will be available in the next few months. I just want to let you know, so all of you, if you're interested, look into our site, and also our Slowcart partners will do this. So I want to put that in place. I want to introduce our phenomenal panelists, starting with Stéphane Crozat, who's the Climate Ambassador of France. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Raisa Julie Ada Ologo, Senior Policy Officer from African Union. Welcome. Jackie Klopp, known academic person we work with a lot, co-director of Center for Sustainable Urban Development for Colombia. Mayor Bruno Covas, welcome. I don't see your video on yet, Bruno, but I just want to let everyone know Bruno just actually got re-elected with a massive vote of support. Bruno, congratulations. I hope you're there hearing me. And finally, we have Mayor Yvonne Aki-Suara. Mayor Suara, welcome. Wonderful to see you again. So what we want to do is kind of jump off from what Andrew set us for about how do we recover and also decarbonize our mobility, and how the mobility sector can play such an important role. I will go around each one of you, ask a question. I would suggest if you can answer in the 4 or 5 minute range, then I can come back to you and have a kind of conversation. That's the goal here, if you can. Stéphane, I want to start with you, because the ambition for climate was put in Paris, and you are the Climate Ambassador of France. I want to hear from you from France, as you think about decarbonization of mobility and green recovery in France. How does that thinking connect with France's ambition going towards the next COP, what Andrew ended up saying? Please, Stéphane.
Well, thank you very much, Annie. Thank you, Andrew, for a great presentation earlier. Well, in transport in France represents about 30% of emissions. So it is a huge sector, 30%, and half of that comes from individual cars driving along the roads. So it's really something that we feel is exceedingly important to try and reach our climate goals. We have European climate goals, but we also try to make sure that we overperform. And what has happened I mean, perhaps going back to the 1980s, we realized that train was the way of the future, and we set up these TGV, these high-speed trains, which in effect have made many of the internal flights disappear. The Paris-Lyon flight was reduced to almost nothing the minute that we introduced the high-speed train. So we've been thinking about that for many, many years, decades, in fact. And perhaps just to say a few words about what happened in the last 2 years. We realized that things were getting out of control. And back in 2017, the government said, okay, well, let's stop, let's pause to think, and let's try and consult citizens and stakeholders on what we need to do to improve on all the points that Andrew so eloquently talked about. And so we created these Assises Nationales de la Mobilité back in 2017. So having the citizens discuss what was best, and it was made into a law that came out in 2017, where we introduced new targets, developing charging points for vehicles, bicycle plans, carpoolings with special lanes and so on. And also we introduced a target for ending the sale of new light vehicles using fossil fuels by 2040. So we're very pleased with that, because 2 years ago, not many countries had that aim. And now what do we see? The acceleration of what's happening. The UK has now said that they would try and do that in beat us by a whole decade and try and do that by 2030. So our ink is not hardly dry, that we might have to try and think to overperform over our own goals. But then what happened next was the COVID crisis, and so that created all the difficulties that Andrew presented at the beginning. And our response there was twofold. First of all, we had a sectoral support plan in the spring of 2020, where we introduced new measures to try and save the sector in many cases, the automotive sector, and also try and make sure that we could deploy new things to make sure that that we could drive a green transition. So we wanted to accelerate the deployment of clean vehicles, and for that we increased financial support for replacing old vehicles and for buying electric or plug-in vehicles, hybrid vehicles. And so that's very concretely, you can get a €5,000 cashback if you buy an electric vehicle. In parallel, we needed to accelerate the deployment of electric charging stations. So we set ourselves a target of some 100,000 charging points publicly accessible by the end of 2021. So we're talking today, you were talking, Andrew, of short term. This is very much short term. And then secondly, we want the support aims to step up investments, to innovate, produce the vehicles of tomorrow in France. We're very proud of our automotive industry with household names, Peugeot, Renault, and so many others. And we want them to really drive the transition towards clean vehicle. And then we felt we needed to support the entire automotive industry, which had really collapsed during the COVID crisis, and which accounts for some 4,000 companies and 400,000 jobs in France. And the idea was to support the ecological transition by developing new skills and redirecting activities towards the production of electric and hydrogen vehicles. And then just to conclude on that phasing of what we've been doing recently, is that the third thing we did was in only last September, we decided to launch what we call the France Relance, the French recovery plan, a 100 billion recovery plan, partly funded by the EU, in fact, through the recovery package of 750 billion. And so this 100 billion recovery plan concentrates in many parts on the ecological transition. And so we have many new new schemes to try and support the acquisition of clean vehicles, to develop public transport, to devote also some almost 500 billion euros will be devoted to support the railway sector. The idea is to offer an attractive and efficient alternative to road transport, both for passengers and for goods, particularly at the time when, as Andrew was saying, public transport is, people are a little bit afraid of it at the moment and tend to go for their private cars. So we have also the transition of the government fleet to clean vehicles. That's also a commitment that the government has taken. It's tens of thousands of vehicles will become clean over the next few years. And also reducing ports emissions with the development of alternative refueling solutions, the installation of electric recharging stations, promoting modal shifts, and so on and so forth. So, so these are many examples to show you what we do in France and how seriously we take that sector, because it, as I said at the beginning, it is 30% of our emissions, and we have to do something about that. Thanks.
Stefan, thank you so much. Thank you for the comprehensive picture you laid out. And I want to come back to you later about how this ambition and the funding that the EU has and France has, how other countries who don't have that level of funding learn from it, that how do you, the political transition behind it. It's very impressive, Stefan. Thank you for sharing. I want to shift from Stefan, who gave a very comprehensive national level picture, to our two city leaders in our panel here, and hear from them what's happening at city level. Bruno, I want to go to you first. First of all, I don't know if you were here. Congratulations to your re-election. All of us who work on mobility are very excited about it. So thank you. We are all behind you. Bruno, one thing Andrew pointed out is the importance of reviving public transport as it's collapsing everywhere. Sao Paulo has one of the biggest fleet of 14,000 plus buses, I think. And he also talked about electrification of, big mobility. I'd love to hear from you, Bruno, what you're thinking about public transit revival and also decarbonization of it. Bruno, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an important meeting. Sao Paulo sticks with the plan of cutting the greenhouse gas emission, even though our federal government doesn't care about the issue, as you all know. But here in Sao Paulo, we signed a new contract with the bus fleet, the company that provides this service here in Sao Paulo. It's a contract of 20 years, and now they have committed with the City Hall to change all the bus fleet. It's one of the largest of the world, with almost 14,000 buses, to reduce in 100% in the next 20 years the emission of greenhouse gas. So in 10 years, they must cut in 90% and 100% in 20 years. One of the possibilities is electricity, but they need to show that they buy electricity for clean electricity. It doesn't. It would be a lot of waste of money if we buy energy from thermoelectric. So it must be a clean energy. So in 10 years, 90% of the emissions will be cut, and in 20 years, 100% of all this fleet. Another important issue that we have invested in the last 4 years, and in January, we start a new term here in Sao Paulo as mayor, is the investment that we have been doing in sidewalks. The legislation here in Sao Paulo was that sidewalks was private, so the City Hall could not invest in that. But last year, the City Council changed this legislation, so we started investing, and in 1 year, we remodel 1,060,000 square meters of sidewalks here in Sao Paulo. And the plan of the next 4 years is more 5 million square feet meters here in Sao Paulo. Another issue and another concern here in the City Hall is the cycle lanes. We had 500 kilometers of cycle lanes. We remodeled 310 kilometers, connecting them with the stations of the subway. And we invest in more 173 kilometers. For the next 4 years, we will have more 300 kilometers of cycle lanes here in Sao Paulo. So this is 3 actions that a City Hall is doing to provide not only the quality of the air, but to show our commitment with this new economy, and to show to our federal government if it's possible to do in a city so complex like Sao Paulo with 12 million people, the federal government can do it in the rest of the country. So it's not an issue that is concerned, it's not an issue that's for left or right parties. It's an issue that everybody who cares about the future of our sons, about the future of our grandsons, about the people that we will never know, never meet, but they have to live here in our world. So this commitment with the future generations is the concerning of the environment, and that's why we need to invest public money, public investment to provide this new quality and to cut the greenhouse emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions here in Sao Paulo and in the world.
Bruno, thank you very much. And we are looking forward to your next term. I want to highlight 2 things Bruno said, which is, I think, for all of us. One is his highlighting of investment on sidewalk, on walking infrastructure. Our research shows in Global South, 1/4 of the population, in some places more, actually walk to work and not take any other. So walking infrastructure investment is a kind of critical, kind of equity-oriented investment. And the other thing, our research really show that walking infrastructure actually has the highest correlation with retail sales. I don't have to tell Stefan, I don't know, Stefan, if you live in Paris, there is a whole correlation between people in outdoors and the retail environment, both for food. So this investment on walking infrastructure is underinvested across the world. So Bruno, big congratulations to you to focusing on that in such a large scale. And the other thing you said, which kind of struck me, is that the decarbonization of your buses, you didn't say electrify. You actually put a performance criteria there that you have to go to zero carbon whichever way you can. And not just zero carbon electrifying thing, but also zero carbon energy. So I think all of us at your scale with 14,000 buses, we can all learn from it. So I just want to highlight those 2 things. Yvonne, I want to go to you next. It will be great to hear. You are well known across the world as a climate leader. I've seen you in many places. I'd love to hear, Yvonne, in this idea of recovery. Every mayor I talk to is talking, the first thing to talk about is jobs right now. How to get employment back, how to create new employment. This connection with recovery and transport, to get people to jobs or investing. What's happening in Freetown? What are you thinking about? Please go ahead, Yvonne.
Thanks, Annie, and thank you very much for having me here. One of the things which I think is so interesting in these conversations is, as Andrew said in his presentation earlier, the extent to which COVID has highlighted inequalities. And when you talk about inequalities around transport, you begin to see that the challenges we're facing. I'm Global South, using the normal expression, so is Bruno, and yet we couldn't be further away in terms of access to resources and the nature of our problem. So Freetown actually had pre the pandemic, and actually still now, 80% of people are using public transport. But what is different here is the definition of public transport. What does public transport entail? In our case, is actually low occupancy. So it's public because people don't own their own vehicles, but can you see how the narrative is different? We're talking about public transport, but it's not a move to public transport, it's a redefinition of what is appropriate public transport, moving from low occupancy to mass transit. With those low occupancy, high polluting vehicles, transport does account for, it is still our highest contribution to greenhouse gas emissions at 33%. And from the perspective of jobs, it's an interesting one, because with the low occupancy, the expectation is that we're going to have a loss of jobs if we move away from that. But in reality, what we are seeking to move to, which is to introduce a cable car system, it is something which, by virtue of the improvement in the economic activity, you just talked about walking. Walking, yes, is important. I'll come back to walking in a second, but actually being able to move across the city in 20 minutes instead of taking 2.5 hours makes people more productive in economic activities. It gives an investment into where we're siting the stations, which include industrial parks, which have long sort of degenerated, our central business district, which is overcrowded and it's just become a sprawl of street trading. So what we are seeking to do from the perspective of this green recovery and reduction in emissions, the revolution in transportation, is to change public transport and move into a cable car system. The numbers are going to work for us. We're looking to move 5,000 people in an hour. We're building on the experience of Bogota and Medellin, and we've been engaging with those cities. We will see a reduction in transport emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of 30%, and we will also see a significant increase in economic activity. And we're coupling this with an investment in the central business district. The main station will be in our CBD, and thankfully we've had access to some funding, partnering with another city, which will allow us to do a new regeneration plan, and that will involve pedestrianization, the introduction, repair, and introduction of pavement. So we're getting people into mass transit, but we're also getting people walking in the CBD. I think it's important for me to mention what the challenges are. This is a project that we started over a year ago, but it's taken some time. I mean, I've heard Bruno, we've shared notes before of the challenge of having a central government and a local government from different political parties, and how that can sometimes have real impacts in coordination. We're not able to move this forward without actually having coordination, agreed approval from the central government because of access to funding, which is the second challenge. So I listen with envy as others talk about, we'll just divert a couple of billion to this or a couple of million to that. No, it's not quite that simple in our case. We're having to actually, we're boxing above our weight to access the funding we need to make this very, very important transition, because the climate crisis requires it. So we are in the process of raising funding. We're applying, and that application requires support of government. So we've been able to thankfully make some progress on that, and we're expecting to see ourselves move beyond all of the planning now to really setting out. But it is a question of looking for funding. We will use a PPP model, but we've also got to make some investments in feasibility studies. All of this will ensure that the recovery, continuation out of being a developing country, moving up that trajectory, to make sure that that happens with a green, resilient outlook. And I think it's important for us as we have these conversations to really bear in mind the challenges and how they differ. And really think about, if we're leaving no one behind and we're wanting to make sure Andrew's picture, which is looking at the global, where we need to be by 2050, we really need to be thinking about how perhaps we're not just looking at our city, our country, but also looking at it more sort of holistically. But we're really grateful for those strides we've made. And we are confident that we will be able to implement this system, which will significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also ensure that we are creating jobs, more jobs in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you also how comprehensively you're thinking about, and the fact you raise a resource constrained environment. Most cities, at least most cities we work in, all over, is exactly what you just described. And the choices we have to make, but how you're thinking about job creation and also mobility, and supporting informal mobility in your city. So very good to hear. I'm going to come back to you a little bit on the equity issue you raised, because I'm very interested in that discussion. Jackie, I want to go to you next. I mean, you've been thinking about these issues for a long time. And I want to go to your favorite topic of informal mobility. And I just want you to help us think through, if we take Andrew's framework together, how do we recover by investment in mobility? And by investing in mobility, we can recover better in not only mobility itself, but also economy. Would this kind of approach leave out the 60% of informal mobility in most of the cities we work in?
Well, I think it is missing to some extent from the framework. So when you want to talk about mass transit, a lot of times people think of subways or BRTs, and that's what tends to get funded in the big cities. But there are towns and smaller cities, and cities where we just need upgraded buses, for example. And that needs to be integrated well with other modes, including, let's say, tuk-tuks or motorcycle taxis, or actually walking, which the mayor just mentioned, which is super important in all our cities, that is clear. And that's also one of the pillars. It's good to see. And cycling, I should say, as well. So we maybe shouldn't just be talking about mass transit, but we should really be talking about a multimodal integrated public transit system of which non-motorized transit is a part. And then here, many cities in the world, many African cities, for example, Nairobi, where I work, actually have a majority of people who take some form of transit and walk. And yet what we're seeing is a bias in a lot of our investment and public foreign assistance, and in also government policy towards mega projects that may not be appropriate, quite frankly. They're expensive, they rely on foreign consultants, and they don't meet the needs when you actually ask people, which is, they want a safe, existing, upgraded bus system. And I should say that COVID, as the mayor mentioned, has shown us that some of these systems are really problematic in terms of crowding and road safety and some of these issues, but we're not investing in fixing those issues, which citizens really want. And I'm glad the ambassador mentioned citizen participation, because here too, I think we're not supporting civil society. And I didn't see it, ironically, as WRI, I consider you part of civil society, on the list of actors that are really important. Because from my experience, really engaging citizens and their organizations and bringing them together, whether they're working on road safety or air pollution or green space, they're a powerful force for moving the money and the focus onto some of the things that are critical, including upgrading the existing public transit system and the non-motorized transport, which is critical. And for some reason, we just haven't been able to support non-motorized transport networks, whereas we can support other things. I think this is something we really need to talk about.
Jackie, on this, I think that Yvonne's point about supporting what in Africa we call paratransit, this gray area between informal and formal transit, which is majority of transit in Africa. There have been a lot of positive examples in the recent past of organizing that you've been part of, you've been supportive. Can you share some of them? Because maybe they are the kernels of something we can actually grow from that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first step is really understanding these systems. Andrew showed some wonderful work that WRI has done with the government in Addis Ababa of actually mapping out these systems, understanding how important they are, and how much access to the city and services they create. That even a large corridor project is not going to solve. Going fast down one corridor is still not going to make your whole city accessible. So, and in many small cities, as I've mentioned, those aren't even on the table as nor should they be necessarily. So now you're understanding your existing transit system and using, you know, GPS to understand how it moves, where the bus stops are. And then, you know, what needs to happen is some investments, including climate finance, going into those systems, because currently a lot of that finance is going into these bigger projects, and not making the cities more accessible for everybody, not necessarily making, you know, the service better for everybody, because what you often find is if you don't do those projects well, they compete with the existing systems and often lose out. So they don't have the ridership they need to really, you know, be worth all that investment. So there needs to be a cooperation with those systems. And the first step is using our technology and innovation to understand how they work and provide passenger information services and some of these things that we expect of any public transport system. The other thing we're seeing, interestingly, particularly in South Africa, which has been through a whole round of large-scale BRT investments, which again, I'm not against, but you know, you need to look at this as an integrated public transport system. What you're seeing is many South African cities are now innovating, working with their minibus taxi operators. So Durban, for example, actually created some budget to have service contracts with minibus taxi operators, and you know, put tracking devices on them to make sure that they provide, you know, they go where they're supposed to go, and have passengers report back on the quality of the service, and then they will actually pay these operators to improve service. They also had a taxi recapitalization program, so creating funds for upgrading of vehicles to make them safer, higher capacity. And by the way, why not start electrifying minibuses as well? Because there's a huge equity problem with air pollution in these kinds of systems. We need to clean this up. And I mean, I could go on some of the innovation. I would just say also that, you know, the infrastructure around bus stops, you know, in some places they're really starting to say, these are part of our transport system. Let's build for them, build nice shades and bus stops and design for them. So I'll stop there.
I think there are a lot of positive examples there, Jackie, that one can accelerate. I really want to go back to Stefan. Stefan, as you heard from both the mayors in this discussion, of a lot of places, not most places, there is really a difficult relation with the cities and national government in these issues that you just heard from Bruno and from Yvonne. But when you talked, you presented a very comprehensive national plans to get a comprehensive set of things that include industries, include cities, of course, the national government. Would love to hear from your perspective the politics of making that happen. Also, you talked about how citizen participation included in planning of these things. So Stefan, just I think everyone would like to hear how we hear all the difficult things that happens, right, in a lot of places, but would like to hear what is happening in France, in Paris, in the EU actually, to have these really positive changes taking place and how it's happening. What can other countries learn from it?
Well, thanks, Ani. Yes, it's a crucial question, in fact, because it's not just the state that can do things; it's the cities, and particularly in transport, it's so important. Two things, maybe. First of all, I'll explain what we experienced recently was what we call the Citizens Climate Convention. It's like a citizens' assembly, and it was a democratic experiment that was very interesting. The government, you may remember, there was this big uproar and civil disobedience with the Gilets jaunes back in 2018, because there was a carbon tax was being introduced, and many French people thought it was just too much, and they rebelled against it. And so the carbon tax increase had to be paused. And so the government thought, well, again, we need to have the citizens think, let's pause and think. And what we did was to organize a set of 150 people chosen at random to try and answer the simple question: how are we going to reach the 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emission that the country has set up for themselves, aligned with the EU goals, and having it be socially acceptable. And so here they were, 150 of them, thinking on what could be done, and they came up with all sorts of recommendations, and a lot of them, in fact, included transport, very concrete, often simple, often easy to implement recommendations, like developing further rail and not just high-speed tracks. I mentioned the high-speed trains between Paris and Lyon, but that was very often at the expense of smaller tracks. Supporting the transition to clean vehicles, developing alternative mobility, reducing VAT on train tickets to make it less expensive, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of these recommendations have been taken on board by the government, and we're now, the government is putting it all into a nice bill, which will be sort of the result of all this thinking by these 150 citizens. So it's a very, very interesting experiment that I think was very successful. And maybe since I have the floor, one more thing about how important it is that the cities take these things on board. And it was so interesting to hear from Freetown and from Sao Paulo. One example from a mid-sized city in France, and that was Dunkerque. Dunkerque decided 200,000 inhabitants, so reasonable sized city, to institute, to have free public transport. From one day to the next, they decided, okay, let's go for it. Let's have free public transport. And a lot of cities had done that already, but they were much smaller towns, about 40 of them since the 70s. But to have a big or mid-sized city doing it was a bit of a gamble. And in fact, it was a huge success. From one year to the next, we had 85% more people taking public transport. They measured the number of incivilities aboard these public transport. It went down by 65%. So and not only that, it was paid for by the companies. So there was no raise in taxes. So huge success. People thought it was complete, something that they really should have done for so many years. And that was through the idea of a mayor and the municipal body that decided to go ahead with it. I could also mention a lot about Paris because it's my hometown, and I've been a keen biker for the last 40 years. And I can tell you 40 years ago, it was something else. Now we have so many bike lanes in Paris, and that's also thanks to the will of the Paris mayor, who sometimes has to fight against a lot of opposition, but I'm completely for it, I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. The Paris mayor is doing a lot from her goal to make it a 15-minute city, and we are all very closely following up. Actually, there is a question on the free public transport. Ben, can you tell us what the question is from our audience?
Sorry, yes. The question is how can we make public transport free? And I think the underlying question there is how do we increase, or if we need to increase subsidy, how do we pay for it, basically?
Thank you, Ben. So there are quite a few cities. Andrew mentioned Luxembourg recently made public transport free. I want to ask this question to Yvonne, actually. Yvonne, what is your thinking of making public transport free? Is it feasible for cities in Global South? And if it is feasible, how would one do it?
So, I mean, that's a question of availability of budget. and perhaps getting some initial investment. The modeling that we've done, which has been borne out by comments made by Andrew and others already, that what you invest in improving the transport infrastructure and greening it, you'll actually get back in the jobs that are created, not only directly created by the system itself, but the knock-on impact on the economy. But the challenge that a low resource country or city like myself experiences is, where does that initial capital investment come from? And that investment is not just going to be in the system itself, but you're going to obviously have to cover those operational costs for a period of time until you begin to see increases in taxes, etc. And it's not a linear sort of, it's not, you put it in and it comes out the next year. So it's a question of investment. And in a case like Freetown, that would need to be subsidized. We simply as a city are not there yet. I think if I had the wherewithal, it's something I would go for. I would believe in it. But I'm going to, we're already being pretty brave in some of the decisions that we're taking here, in where we're spending, in where we're deciding to invest. We're sure. I mean, what we've done in sort of nature-based solutions, in tree planting, for example, there, people would say there are 100 other things you could have done with that money, but we really believe it's going to improve water provision, it's going to reduce heat, it's going to reduce floods, etc., improve quality of life. So it's getting the right balance. So in short, love to do it. Can I do it today? Sadly not. But this is why I come back to saying, to what extent do we begin to look at pooling resources so that, those who are less challenged are able to assist those who are more challenged, so that overall, because this is, we're living in a globe. What happens in one part of the world affects the other. So nobody should think that they're comfortable and they're safe. COVID has shown us that that is not the case. And the climate is doing the same thing. Thanks, Annie.
Yvonne, I very much like how you phrase it. It's a global issue. It's not just one city. But the striking fact is, you're absolutely right. The funding that's available to Freetown or any other city in Global South will be very difficult to make public transport free. However, just the science of it, or just the evidence of it, the work like people like Jackie or me and others do, the actual investment needed, the biggest thing that is subsidized today is basically private cars in the world. In cities, the biggest amount of public dollar subsidy goes to private car owners because we build roads, give them free parking or whatever, I can go on. Yet we never think that as a subsidy. We think about subsidy when we talk about public transport. So it is very interesting.
And it was built already. The roads were built already. We're talking about what we're doing now.
No, but we are putting money on these things. Bruno, are you still there? I want to bring you in on what Stefan talked about. I actually don't see you on my screen. Bruno? I'll come back to Bruno in a minute. I wanted to really go back to Stefan's point on citizen participation on these decisions, because we can have these decisions that are scientific or better for climate, but the point that Stefan, you made from learning from the resistance that came from citizens, that you changed path and created these 150 people, or that created really a different kind of outcome that you embraced. I know, Jackie, you've done a lot of work on how, and you raised it just earlier, how this can reshape this narrative of how we get recovery and green climate together. I would love to hear from Jackie, your experience on these. And Yvonne, I would love to go back to Freetown on citizen participation issue. That I know you've done a lot of work on that. Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, I think, citizen participation is really critical in shaping goals. And, we keep seeing a mismatch, like you were just saying, Annie, between what people are asking for often and what they're getting. Nairobi right now is the middle of a struggle where they're building a massive expressway from the highway to the wealthy part of the city in the West. That is very typical. I think other cities have experienced that. And we're seeing the trees being cut down, which is horrible given everything that Yvonne just said about their need for those trees. And clearly, public transport and the pedestrianization that's needed is not happening. I think we really need to start figuring out how we support citizen voice more in this process. I think that it's just critical. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you have. And a lot of the time we think about big infrastructure, we think only engineers and big decision makers can make these decisions. It's actually breaking it down to community level decision that impacts community, the way Stefan talked about, actually makes a big difference and makes bigger decisions more acceptable as part of it. Yvonne, I want to go back to you in Freetown. How have, in the discussions you were initially doing about public transport reform, the thing that you're doing with your mobility plans across city, how has the citizen voice been incorporated in your decision making, and what can we, rest of us, learn from it?
So I say that sort of in 4 levels of engagement. We kicked off with a conference back in, it was December 2019. And that was done with UCL, who are also working on some transport initiatives, and it was sort of built into that. So it gave a cross section of sort of citizens an opportunity to hear the plans. One of the main cable car manufacturers, Doppelmayr, came to Freetown for that event. And so was able to share and kind of like socialize the idea and get feedback. And there was a lot of feedback because it's really novel. You know, we're talking about a city where a lot of people have never even heard of a cable car. But of course, when we come back to the question of the cost of trams, or which need wide infrastructure, underground subways completely out of the question. Even with buses, it's actually bus lanes getting dedicated bus lanes. They're actually quite challenging when a city's been built in a way where bringing those in would require massive reclamation, purchases of housing. It's very complicated. So we live in a hilly city. So going up into the air and connecting with the hills just made a lot more sense. So we had that engagement. We've also identified potential. So the idea with very much on the Medellin model, the idea with our cable car is connecting underserved hillside communities, deprived hillside communities with the center. So that the lines are going up into the hills and coming back down. And for where all of these communities are, where all of the stations are going to be built, we've actually had community meetings there. And community members have kind of like identified where they think would be best. And a lot of excitement has been generated, a lot of questions. Electricity is not stable here. So the obvious question that everybody asked at the beginning was, what if the lights go off and you're up in the air? But of course it comes with its own generator, and there'll be solar powered element. But these are all sort of the way the conversation has gone. We've also had academics and the Australian Institution of Engineers to have more technical conversations. We are very fortunate. Again, this is collaboration and partnering, but the American Institute of Architects are pro bono working with us for the design of the stations. So that their trips here have also been another source of engagement with technical stakeholders. And the final thing that we did just about a month ago, was just during this pandemic period, was to have a Zoom call. And we brought on Zoom the team working on a cable car in Lagos, the African Development Bank, who is working with us in a financing package, as well as a representative from Bogota and from Medellin. And we basically just had an opportunity for residents of the city to listen to the presentation and then just ask their questions. So it's ongoing, but it really, there's been a lot of community, there's been a lot of citizen and resident. And the interesting thing about something like this is a lot of people don't come at it thinking about climate. They just think about it as an alternative mode of transport, and is this really going to work for us? But the platform gives us the opportunity also to really drive the climate conversation and the need for us to reduce emissions.
Well, I really like the way you described the city-to-city learning that is going on in your cable car project between Medellin, between Lagos, and I hope my friend Mauricio is helping you get some.
Absolutely. Oh, I should say, I mean, the University of Penn, where Monsieur is, we actually have a team of his postgrad students working on some analysis of how property values are going to increase where the cable car stations are. So this is a big sort of collaborative effort that's going on.
That's fantastic. It's very good to hear that. Ben, we might have a chance for one quick question from the audience. I see that you have a question from the audience. Ben, if you can be quick.
Yeah, we have a good question which may come at the end here. It's how do we align different stimulus resources in this recovery in a way that we don't contradict our social and environmental goals? For example, recovery into the auto industry, or how we can have more banks providing low interest rates for individual motorization away from sustainable mobility tracks.
Thank you very much. This is a very good question. This is my favorite question. Whenever I have German government officials in my meetings, I always ask this question about auto industry recovery and green goals. So Stefan, I'm going to ask you, you're the surrogate here of the EU.
Well,
how does one balance this recovery and make sure it's green?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's absolutely essential, and that's why my government has tried to put in place in three different stages that I highlighted earlier was precisely to make sure that the recovery was that we could make the most, in fact, of this COVID crisis and the huge recovery money that we have managed to mobilize through our own deficit and through EU funding, through EU solidarity, into green transition. And it's a great opportunity to seize. That's why we have to make sure that when we plow money into the automobile sector, it won't be to just save jobs for more fossil fuel motors, but to spearhead the transition. So in fact, we see that as a great opportunity to reconcile both the recovery from COVID and also the long-term, well, yes, actually not so long-term, the medium-term goal of 2030 to reach our targets of 2030 on the road to carbon neutrality in 2050.
Stefan, I want to wish you best of luck. I hope everyone's listening to you about how to invest on automotive recovery. We're almost to the end. I do want to, for our audience, want to give everyone one sentence about, if you think about next year to COP, which is what this event is organized, to with ambition. What are you, one sentence about what is your best hope that'll happen and in the next COP or the climate discussion among countries that we should all be working towards? Yvonne, I'll start from you. Whatever comes to your mind, I think we want to hear from your perspective how the next year should look like. Please.
I'm going to say access to funding, particularly at a city level. You've got an ambitious plan as ours. We're going to be applying to the Green Climate Fund. If we don't have the access to funding, the political will to make the difference is not going to actually translate into a difference. And that's going to be true of cities other than mine. So as we go to COP, let's think about making sure the resources are available to everyone, to all the cities that require them, to all the nations that require them. We've got to get that bit right. Thanks.
Thank you, Yvonne. Well said. Jackie?
Yeah, I would say smart, equitable climate finance that generates lots of co-benefits in terms of jobs and health. And if we do that, I think we will go very far.
If we can communicate that co-benefit, Jackie, if we can do that successfully, it'll be fantastic. Thank you. Stefan?
Well, if I had to choose one word, it would be ambition. And we have the Climate Ambition Summit coming up on the 12th of December, which will gather world leaders. It's convened by the UN, by France, UK, in partnership with Chile and Italy. And the idea is, since we don't have a COP, we still need to move ahead. And we've convened all the leaders that have something to say, to show their ambition, to drive up their ambition, be it in finance, in mitigation, in adaptation, in order to be ready for COP26 and really work both on the long term. And we've had very good news for the long term from China, from South Korea, from Japan, with carbon neutrality in 2060, 2050, and 2050 respectively. But we also need to, as Andrew said at the beginning, to work for the short term. And that's why we want the leaders to come up with very ambitious goals right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. This event Stefan's talking about, I think it's the 12th of December. We are all looking forward to kind of leaders actually announcing ambition plan. I really want to thank all of you panelists. It's been a really fascinating conversation. It's great to see all of you. I want to thank Andrew for a really stirring and fantastic presentation of what are the issues. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us. I want to thank Dutch government, TDA, SLOCAT, and all our partners for helping us put together this fantastic series. Audience member, I hope you enjoyed it. As I mentioned, the talk that Andrew presented will be available, I don't think as eloquently or as passionately like Andrew presented, but it will be available on paper for us to look at and read. So we will share that with all of you. Thank you very much. Wonderful to see all of you. And I hope I'll see some of you, all of you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.